I took the job at the station because I needed the quiet, and the forest gave me that without asking anything in return. The posting was remote enough that most rangers passed on it, and I understood why the moment I drove the last 12 miles of unpaved road to get there. The station was a squat building with a metal roof and a covered porch that looked out over a tree line. So dense the sunlight hit it like a wall. There was an equipment shed out back and a gravel lot just big enough for 3 trucks, and that was the whole of it. Vic had been there 11 years when I arrived, and he had the kind of stillness about him that either meant he was at peace with the place or had simply stopped fighting it. Lena came 2 years before me, and she was sharp and efficient and did not waste words on things she considered settled. The 3 of us fell into a rhythm quickly because the work demanded it. We ran split patrols on a rotation that covered the main trails during daylight hours, and we kept the station log updated. And we checked in with the district office every Thursday whether there was anything to report or not. The Eastern Trail was the longest stretch we managed, and it ran 8 miles through old-growth timber that had never been logged. Most hikers underestimated it. The trail markers were maintained, but the terrain got rough past mile 4, and the light dropped fast once you were deep enough in the canopy. In 5 years, I had pulled 2 hikers out with twisted ankles, and once helped locate a group that had camped a mile off the marked path without telling anyone their plans. None of that prepared me for what the Eastern Trail would eventually show me. The first missing persons report came in on a Tuesday in late October. A couple had signed in at the trailhead on Sunday morning and never signed out. Their car was still in the lot when I checked. Vic looked at the log sheet for a long moment before he set it back down on the desk without a word. I told him I wanted to go out and walk the trail before we lost the last of the afternoon light. He looked at me the way you look at someone who has just said something that cannot be taken back. He said we would call it in to the district and let the search team handle it. I told him the search team was 4 hours out at minimum, and there were 2 people who might still be on that trail. Lena came in from the back room and stood in the doorway, and I could see from her face that she had already heard the conversation. She did not argue with Vic, and she did not back me up. She just stood there, and the silence between the 2 of them said more than either of them was willing to say out loud. I filed the report and made the call to the district and spent the rest of the evening at the window watching the eastern tree line until the last light was completely gone. I did not see anything that first night. I told myself that was a good sign. By the end of the week, I understood it was not. The search team came out Wednesday morning and walked the trail in both directions and found nothing. No gear, no signs of a camp, no footprints past mile 3 despite the soft ground from recent rain. The team lead told me it happened more than people realized, and that sometimes hikers made out a different way and just forgot to sign out. He said it with the practiced calm of someone delivering a line they had used before. Vic thanked him and walked him back to his vehicle, and I watched the whole exchange on the porch and noticed that neither of them seemed particularly troubled by the outcome. I started paying closer attention after that. I pulled the sign-in logs for the Eastern Trail, going back to the start of the season, and I sat at the desk after dinner and went through every entry. There were gaps, not many but enough. Names that appeared at the trailhead with a sign-in time and no corresponding sign-out. Some were recent, and some went back years, and the pattern was tight enough that it was not explainable by forgetful hikers. Every gap fell between late September and early December. Every single one. I did not say anything to Vic or Lena that night. I put the logs back exactly where I found them, and I went in my bunk and lay there in the dark listening to the forest and thinking about the lights I had not yet seen but would start seeing 3 days later. They appeared just after 11 on a Friday night. I was at the window with a cup of coffee that had gone cold, and I was not expecting to see anything. The lights were faint, and they moved between the trees in a way that was deliberate and slow. They were not flashlights. The movement was wrong for that. Too smooth and too low to the ground in places. I counted at least 4 of them over the span of about 20 minutes before they disappeared deeper into the tree line and did not come back. I went to Vic's door and knocked. He answered faster than a man who had been asleep should have. I told him what I saw. He was quiet for a moment, and then he told me it was probably a reflection off the creek that ran parallel to the trail about a quarter mile in. I knew it was not a reflection. He knew I knew. He told me to get some sleep and close the door, and I stood in the hallway for a long moment before I walked back to the window. The tree line was dark and still. Whatever had been moving out there was gone. I wrote down the time and what I had seen in my personal notebook, because I had stopped trusting the station log to hold everything that mattered. I did not sleep much that night. The second group of missing hikers was reported 4 days later, and that was when everything between the 3 of us changed in a way that could not be undone. I remember sitting at the desk the morning after the second report came in and watching Vic pour his coffee with the same steady hand he always had, and wondering how a man could be that calm about 2 more people going missing on a trail he patrolled every week. Lena was at the map table going over the terrain markers, and she had her back to me, and I could see the tension in her shoulders from across the room. I asked Vic directly if he thought the 2 disappearances were connected. He said missing persons on remote trails was not unusual, and that the district would handle it the same way they handled the first one. I told him the first one was never actually handled. He set his mug down and turned, and looked at me with an expression I had not seen on him before. It was not anger. It was closer to exhaustion mixed with something that looked like guilt. He told me to trust the process, and that pushing on things that did not need pushing would not help anyone. I asked him what that meant. He picked his mug back up and walked out onto the porch and let the screen door close behind him. Lena finally turned around from the map table. She looked at me for a moment like she was deciding something. She started to speak, and then stopped and shook her head slightly and went back to the maps. I had worked alongside these 2 people for 5 years. I knew their routines and their moods and the way they moved through the station, like I knew the layout of the trails. What I did not know until that morning was that there was a version of this place they both understood that I had never been shown. I spent that afternoon going through supply room on the pretense of doing an inventory check. The old logbook was on the bottom shelf behind a row of spare radio batteries. It was a standard Ranger log, but the date on the inside cover was 1974, and the station, as I knew it had not been built until 1989. I did not take it back to my bunk right away. I stood in the supply room and read the first 3 entries standing up, and by the third one my hands had stopped being entirely steady. I put it back where I found it and finished the inventory and went to dinner and said nothing. That night, I lay in my bunk and stared at the ceiling and made a decision that I would go back for that logbook the next day and read every page. Whatever Vic and Lena were protecting in their silence was written down in that book by someone who had come before all of us, and I was done waiting for one of them to decide I was ready to hear it. The next morning came in cold and gray with low cloud cover that kept the forest dim well past sunrise. I did my patrol early and moved fast, and was back at the station before Vic had finished his second cup of coffee. Lena was out on the North Loop and would not be back until early afternoon. I went to the supply room and pulled the logbook and took it to my room and sat on the edge of my bunk and started reading from the beginning. The early entries were routine. Trail conditions, wildlife sightings, maintenance notes, visitor counts. The handwriting was small and neat, and whoever wrote it was thorough. About 40 pages and the tone shifted. The entries became shorter, and the language became careful in a way that felt deliberate. Words were chosen to describe things without fully describing them. Phrases like the boundary held and the eastern markers were checked, and no movement above ground appeared with regularity that made it clear they were not casual observations. They were confirmations. Someone had been checking the eastern trail not for hiker safety, but for something else entirely, and reporting back in language that was coded enough to look routine if you did not know what you were reading. I found the entry dated November 3rd, 1978, and that was the one that made me sit back and press my hand flat against the page like I needed to feel that it was real. The entry read, 2 taken this season, within acceptable terms, boundary intact, station secure. That was it. 2 people had gone missing, and the ranger who wrote that entry treated it as a normal outcome inside an arrangement that had acceptable terms. I read the rest of the book in one sitting. By the time I reached the final entries, I had a picture that was incomplete but coherent enough to turn my stomach. Something lived beneath the Eastern Trail. It had been there longer than the station. The rangers who came before had not discovered it and reported it. They had found it and negotiated with it. I closed the book and sat in the quiet of my room and listened to the forest outside the window. It sounded exactly the same as it always had. That was the part one could not get past. 5 years of patrols and morning coffee and quiet evenings on the porch. And the whole time, there was something beneath the ground on the Eastern Trail that the people standing next to me every day had known about and said nothing. I put the logbook inside my personal pack and went back out to the common room and waited for Lena to come in from the North Loop. Vic came in from the equipment shed with grease on his hands and stopped in the doorway when he saw us both sitting at the table. He looked at Lena first, and she gave him the smallest nod. He washed his hands at the sink without saying anything and dried them on a shop rag and pulled out the chair at the head of the table and sat down. I put the logbook on the table between us. He looked at it for a long moment, and then he looked at me, and I could see him deciding how much to say and in what order to say it. He started with the history, because that was the easiest part. The forest had been federal land since the early 1900s, but people had been moving through it for centuries before that. The original ranger presence out here was not established to manage trails or protect wildlife. It was established because people kept disappearing in the eastern section, and the government wanted someone on the ground to monitor the situation. The rangers who came first did not know what they were dealing with. They found out the same way anyone finds out when they are in a place like this long enough. Something made contact. Vic used that phrase carefully, and I did not interrupt him. The contact was not violent. It was territorial. Whatever lived beneath the Eastern Trail had been there long enough that it considered the forest above it an extension of itself, and the people who moved through it were moving through its space without permission. The early rangers tried to report it and were not believed. 2 of them requested transfers and were denied. One wrote the logbook. I was now holding on the table between us. By the time that ranger finished his posting, he had reached an understanding with whatever was below, and he passed that understanding on to the next ranger assigned to the station, and that ranger passed it to the next. Vic had been handed that understanding on his 3rd week at the station by the ranger he replaced, and he had carried it for 11 years. I asked him why he never told me. He said he had been waiting to see if I would last. He said some rangers felt the wrongness of the place inside the first year and put in for a transfer on instinct, and those were the ones who never needed to know. I had stayed 5 years, and the forest had apparently decided I was worth keeping. I did not like the way he said that last part. Lena had her hands flat on the table, and she was looking at the wood grain, and not at either of us. I asked her how long she had known. She said since her 4th month at the station. I asked her why she never said anything to me either. She said the same thing Vic had said in different words. She said the rules only worked if everyone at the station understood them completely and followed them without exception, and that telling someone half the truth was more dangerous than telling them nothing at all. I asked what the rules were. Vic laid them out. No one goes onto the Eastern Trail after dark under any circumstances. If hikers go missing after sunset, you file a report and wait for the district team. You do not go looking. You do not call attention to the opening at mile 5. You do not interfere with what happens below the boundary. In exchange, the things beneath the trail stay beneath it. They do not come above ground near the station. They do not follow rangers back from patrols. The station stays safe as long as the terms are honored. I asked him what happened when the terms were not honored. He was quiet for a moment. He told me about a ranger named Pritchard who had been at the station in the early 90s. Pritchard had been told the rules and had followed them for 2 years, and then a family of 4 went missing on the Eastern Trail in November, and he could not leave it alone. He went out at night against everything he had been told. He came back the next morning. He was physically unharmed. He could walk and eat and sleep and perform basic functions, but he could not speak, and he could not hold a sustained thought, and whatever had been essentially in behind his eyes was gone. He spent the rest of his life in a care facility and never recovered. Vic said the district wrote it up as a psychological break brought on by isolation. Lena said Pritchard was not the only one. There had been others over the decades who had broken the terms and come back the same way. Present but emptied. I sat with that for a minute. Outside the window, the forest was doing what it always did in the middle of the day. Birds, wind in the upper canopy, the sound of the creek somewhere past the tree line. Normal in every way that could be heard. I asked Vic what exactly was down there. He said he did not know the full answer to that. He said the logbook held more description than he had been able to confirm firsthand, and that he made a deliberate choice not to get close enough to find out. He said the original ranger who negotiated the terms had described him as old, not old like an animal species is old. Old like a feature of the land is old, like a river or a ridge. Something that had been there so long that it stopped being a thing that arrived and had simply become part of the place. I asked if the people who went missing were dead. Vic looked at the table. Lena closed her eyes. He said he did not believe they were dead. He said the logbook suggested they were kept. I asked what kept meant. He said he did not know exactly, and that was the honest answer. I asked if anyone had ever gone below and come back intact. There was a long silence. Vic said not in any record he had found. I pushed back from the table and stood up and went to a window and looked out at the eastern tree line. 2 groups of people were somewhere beneath that trail right now. Paul and Jess from the second group were out there. A couple whose names I had logged into the system on a Tuesday morning were out there. Whatever keeping meant it was happening to real people in real time, and the 3 of us were sitting at a table inside a warm building, following rules that kept us safe while those people stayed below in the dark. I did not say any of that out loud. I turned back from the window and told Vic I needed some air and walked out onto the porch. The screen door closed behind me. I stood there looking at the tree line for a long time. By the time I went back inside, I had already made my decision. I was not going to say anything about it yet. I was going to let another day pass, and I was going to read that logbook front to back again, and I was going to find out everything it said about the opening at mile 5, and then I was going to go out there regardless of what it cost me. That night, I sat on my bunk with the logbook open across my knees and read every page twice. The original ranger who wrote it had been methodical in a way that felt like someone trying to leave a complete record for whoever came next. His name was written on the inside cover, as are Moss, and he had been stationed out here from 1971 to 1979. He wrote about the first contact in his second year, with a kind of careful understatement that told me it had shaken him badly, even if he never wrote that directly. He described hearing movement beneath the trail surface during a night patrol. Not an animal, not water, something deliberate and patterned. He went back in the daylight and found the opening beneath the root cluster at mile 5 and described it as a vertical shaft dropping into darkness with what appeared to be hand-worked stone around the upper rim. Hand-worked. That detail stayed with me. Whatever was down there had shaped the entrance with intent at some point in its history. Moss wrote that he had lowered a light on a cord and could see the shaft open into a larger space below, but that the light was not sufficient to show him how large. He heard movement below and pulled the light back up and left the trail. He came back for more times over the next 3 months before anything made direct contact. The contact came at night. He wrote that he'd been on the porch of the old field shelter that predated the current station when he became aware that something was standing at the tree line watching him. He did not describe what it looked like in detail in that first entry. He only wrote that it was large and that its posture was wrong in a way that took him a moment to process. It stood there for a long time and he sat very still, and eventually it withdrew back into the trees. He wrote that he did not feel threatened. He wrote that feeling puzzled him afterward more than the encounter itself had. The subsequent entries described a gradual process that Moss called the approach, and that I understood to mean that whatever was down there had been taking his measure the same way he had been taking its. By the fall of 1973, Moss was writing about something. He called the terms as if they had been established through a process he did not fully detail, but that he seemed to consider settled. He wrote about the boundary with the precision of someone describing a legal document. The eastern trail above Mile 4 functioned as a threshold. Anyone who passed Mile 4 after dark had crossed into territory the things below considered theirs. The station and everything north of Mile 4 was off limits to them in exchange. Hikers who followed the rules and stayed off the trail at night were safe. Hikers who did not were not. Moss did not write about this with horror. He wrote about it the way a man writes about a weather pattern, as a condition of the landscape that had to be managed and planned around. That was the part that disturbed me most. Not what was down there, but how thoroughly a human being could normalize it given enough time and enough incentive to keep himself safe. I closed a logbook just before midnight and sat on the floor beside my bunk. The station was quiet. I could hear Vic's steady breathing through the thin wall between our rooms. I lay there and thought about Pritchard coming back from below with the lights off behind his eyes. And I thought about the family of four who had gone missing the year Pritchard broke. And I thought about Paul and Jess, who had signed in at the trailhead 8 days ago and never come back. The decision I had made on the porch that afternoon had not changed. If anything, reading the logbook had sharpened it. Moss had written in his final entry that the terms were the only humane solution he had been able to find, and I understood what he meant by that. He had tried to find another way and concluded there was not one. I was not ready to accept that conclusion. I was not ready to sit in this station for another 5 years and log the names of people who went missing on a trail I was supposed to protect and call it an acceptable outcome. I set my alarm for 5 in the morning. I was going to walk that trail in daylight, and I was going to find the opening at Mile 5, and I was going to see it for myself before I decided anything else. I was on the trail by 5:40 with a full water bottle and my personal pack, and the kind of focus that comes from a decision already made. The morning was cold, and the ground was soft from overnight moisture, and the canopy above the first 2 miles was thin enough that the early light came through in long, pale strips across the path. I had walked this trail dozens of times in 5 years and knew every bend and grade change well enough to move quickly. I was not rushing. I wanted to see everything clearly, and I wanted time to think between what I found. The first 4 miles were exactly what they always were. Trail markers in good condition. No signs of recent foot traffic beyond what the weekend hikers had left before the disappearances. The forest was doing its normal morning routine, and the birds were loud, and the creek ran steady somewhat to my left, and nothing felt wrong yet. Mile 4 was marked with a double post away all the significant distance points were, and I stopped there and stood for a moment. Past this point, the trail changed. The canopy closed in, and the light dropped, and the old growth trees on either side were massive enough that their root systems had buckled the path in places. The undergrowth was thicker here, and the trail narrowed to a single track that required attention to follow. I had been past Mile for maybe a dozen times in 5 years, and never past Mile 6. There had never been a reason to go further. The trail terminated at Mile 8 at a fire road that connected back to the main park route. But very few hikers made it that far, and the ones who did usually camped overnight. I moved past the marker and kept my pace steady. The forest was quieter here in the way forests get when the density increases and the sound gets absorbed by the biomass around you. My footsteps sounded flat. About 100 yards past the marker, I found the first piece of evidence. A hiking pole was leaning against a tree just off the left side of the path. It was clean and undamaged and had been placed there deliberately rather than dropped. Someone had set it there on purpose, or something had set it there. I photographed it with my phone and kept moving. At around mile 4.5, I found a day pack sitting upright in the middle of the trail. The zipper was closed and the pack was full. And when I opened, I found a water filter, a first aid kit, a rain jacket, and a phone with a cracked screen and a dead battery. The name written in marker on the inside of the collar of the rain jacket was Jess. I stood there holding that jacket for longer than I should have. I put everything back in the pack and zipped it closed and left it exactly where I found it because I did not want to disturb the scene before I understood what I was looking at. I kept moving toward mile 5. The trail bent to the right about 200 yards before the 5-mile marker, and it was just past that bend that I noticed the ground had changed. The root systems of the old trees along this section were enormous, and they ran across the trail's surface in thick roping networks that made the footing uneven. I was watching the ground carefully, and that was why I saw it. There was a section of root cluster on the left side of the trail, where the roots had grown in a rough circle around a central depression in the earth. The depression was about 3 feet across, and it was not visible until you were almost on top of it, because the roots arched over it from multiple directions. I crouched down and moved one of the roots aside and looked at what was underneath. The opening was there exactly where Moss had described it. A vertical shaft maybe 2.5 feet in diameter dropping straight down into darkness with a rim of worked stone around the upper edge. The stone was old, not just weathered old, but old in a way that tells you something was cut and placed by hands that were not working with modern tools. I pulled out my flashlight and aimed it into the shaft. The beam hit nothing for a long time before it caught what looked like a floor maybe 30 feet down. The walls of the shaft were smooth and dark and slightly damp. I could see where the shaft opened into a wider space at the bottom. I stayed crouched there for probably 2 minutes just looking. The forest around me was completely silent, not the comfortable silence of early morning. The kind of silence that happens when everything that lives in a place has stopped moving at the same time. I became aware of the stillness, the way you become aware of a smell. Gradually and then all at once, I was about to stand up when I heard it. A sound from below, not loud, not a voice, a shifting, like something large adjusting its position on a stone floor. Deliberate and slow and close enough that whatever made it was not at the bottom of the shaft. It was somewhere between the bottom and where I was crouched. I did not move. The sound came again. The same quality of movement. Patient, aware. I eased myself backward from the opening and stood up slowly and took 4 steps back toward the center of the trail. Nothing came up through the opening. Nothing appeared at the rim. But the silence held for another 30 seconds before the birds started up again in the canopy overhead, and the forest came back to itself the way it does when a predator moves on. I stood there on the trail and looked at the root cluster for a long moment. Then I turned and walked back toward the station at a pace that was controlled but not slow. I needed to think before I did anything else. I needed to decide what finding Jess's pack meant in terms of what came next. The mile markers passed, and the light got better as the canopy thinned, and by the time I hit mile 2, I had worked through enough of it to know that daylight reconnaissance was one thing, and that what I was actually planning required a different kind of preparation. Vic was on the porch when I came out of the tree line. He watched me cross the gravel lot, and I watched him read my face from 20 feet away. He stood up from his chair. I walked past him into the station and set my pack down on the table and turned around and told him I had found Jess's pack at mile 4.5. He was quiet. I told him I had found the opening. He closed his eyes for just a second. I told him I had heard something moving inside it. He sat down in the nearest chair and put both hands on the table and looked at them. I told him I was not filing this under the terms. I told him I was not going to write this up as a missing persons case for the district to not follow up on. He looked up at me. He said my name once. Just that. The way a man says a name when he wants the other person to understand the weight of what comes next without having to spell it out. I told him I heard him. I sat down across from him, and we looked at each other across the table. And the station was very quiet, and outside the forest held everything it was holding and waited. Lena came in about 20 minutes later from her morning check on the north perimeter fence. She pulled off her jacket and hung it by the door and looked at the two of us sitting at the table and knew immediately that something had changed. Vic told her what I had found. She sat down and folded her hands and listened without interrupting. When he finished, she looked at me with an expression that was hard to read. There was something in it that might have been fear and something else underneath that looked like it might have been recognition. I told her I needed her to tell me everything she knew about what was in the logbook that Moss had not written down. She looked at Vic. He gave her a small nod. She was quiet for a moment before she started talking. She said the things below the trail were not a single creature. They were a group. She did not know how large a group because no one had been below and come back with that information intact. The logbook described at least 6 distinct contacts at the tree line over the years, and each contact suggested a different individual based on size and behavior. She said they moved between the upper world and the lower one to the shaft and through other access points that had never been located. She said they did not appear to require light to navigate. She said the ones that had been seen above ground at night move with fluidity that suggested they were completely at ease in the dark in a way that a human being never could be. I asked her how she knew all of this if it was not in the logbook. She looked at the table. She said there were things Vic had told her when she first arrived that he had been told by the ranger before him, an oral record that ran alongside the written one, details that had been kept out of the logbook deliberately because whoever wrote them down had not wanted them to exist anywhere that could be found and read by the wrong person. I asked what the wrong person meant in that context. Vic said it meant someone from the district, someone who would come out here and make decisions based on protocol rather than understanding, someone who would break the terms through ignorance and leave whoever was stationed here to deal with the consequences. I sat back in my chair. The picture was complete enough now that I could see its whole shape, a decades-long arrangement between human beings and something beneath the earth that everyone involved had decided was preferable to the alternative. Hikers who wandered past the boundary after dark were the price of keeping the station safe and the forest quiet. The rangers who ran this station were not park employees in the full sense of the word. They were custodians of a boundary, managers of the secret that had been passed from hand to hand for 50 years. I asked Vic directly whether he had ever tried to get people out from below. He said yes. Once, in his 3rd year, he had not gone into the shaft. He had gone to the edge of it and called down and waited. He said something had come to the base of the shaft and looked up at him. He said it had not been hostile. It had been patient. It had waited while he called down, and when he stopped it had moved away from the base of the shaft, and he had heard nothing more. He said the hiker he had been trying to reach had signed into the trail 2 days before, and he had no way to know if that person was still alive. He said after that experience he made a decision to stop trying to understand what the arrangement meant in human terms and focus entirely on maintaining it. I looked at him for a long time after he said that. I did not say what I was thinking. What I was thinking was that Vic had made his peace with something I had not made my peace with, and that the difference between us was the only thing that mattered right now. I waited 2 days before I made my move, and I used those 2 days well. I ate dinner with Vic and Lena both nights and kept the conversation on routine things and let them believe I had settled into the reality of the situation the way they had. Vic seemed relieved. Lena watched me more carefully than Vic did, but she did not push. I think she wanted to believe I had accepted it, because the alternative was something she did not want to deal with. On the second day, I drove the supply truck into town under the pretense of picking up a parts order for the equipment shed, and I bought 2 high-output headlamps with fresh batteries and a 50-foot length of nylon rope rated for climbing loads. I also bought a pair of thin work gloves and a small bolt of reflective tape that I planned to use as a trail marker inside the shaft, so I could find a way back up without having to think about it. I drove back to the station and put everything in my personal pack and buried the pack under my bunk. That night, I lay in the dark and went over the plan until it stopped feeling like a plan and started feeling like a sequence of steps with outcomes I could manage. The shaft was 30 feet deep based on what I had seen with the flashlight. The bottom opened into a larger space. I would descend on the rope and take stock of the space before moving further. I would keep my light on at all times. I would not go deeper than necessary. I would find Paul and Jess, and I would get them to the base of the shaft and get them up and out. That was the whole of it. I knew there were variables I could not account for, and I had made my peace with that. What I had not made my peace was leaving 2 people below that trail for one more night, while I sat in a warm building pretending everything was manageable. Vic fell asleep early. I could hear his breathing change through the wall, within an hour of him going to his room. Lena stayed up later, and I lay still and waited until the light under her door went out, and I gave it another 40 minutes after that before I moved. I dressed in the dark, boots laced tight, jacket zipped, pack on, radio clipped to my chest strap on a low volume setting. I picked up my boots and carried them to the front door and put them on outside on the porch so the sound of the laces wouldn't carry. The night was cold and very clear, and the stars were out and away. They only get out here where there is no competing light for 50 miles in any direction. I stood on the porch for a moment and looked at the eastern tree line. It was dark and still. I crossed the gravel lot carefully and entered the trail at the main head and turned on the lower of my 2 headlamps once I was inside the tree line. I moved at a steady pace. The trail was familiar enough that the darkness did not slow me much, and I had walked this section often enough that my feet knew the grade changes without needing to see them. The forest at night sounded different than it did in the day. Not louder, differently populated. The things that move through it after dark move with more confidence and less predictability, and I was aware that in a way I had not been on previous night patrols before I understood what the Eastern Trail held. I passed the 2-mile marker and the 3-mile marker without incident. The air got colder as the canopy thickened, and by mile 4 I had switched to the brighter headlamp. Past the double post, the trail narrowed, and the root systems buckled the path, and I slowed my pace and watched the ground. Jess's pack was still where I had left it at mile 4.5. I stopped and looked at it for a moment, leaving it there. It felt right at the time, and it still felt right. I kept moving. The bend in the trail before mile 5 came up, and I rounded it and slowed to a careful walk. The root cluster was on my left, and I approached it from the trail side and crouched down and moved the outer roots aside, and there was the opening exactly as I had left it. I tied the rope around the largest root at the cluster's edge and tested it with my full weight 3 times before I trusted it. I put on my work gloves and clipped the backup light to my jacket front and started down. The shaft was tight around the shoulders, but not impossibly so, and the work stone of the walls gave my boots enough purchase that I could control my descent. I pressed a strip of reflective tape to the stone at the 5-foot mark and another at the 15-foot mark, so I could find the rope from below. The air changed as I descended. It was warmer than the surface, which was wrong. Caves ran cold. Whatever this space was, it was not a cave in the geological sense. The warmth had a quality to it that I did not want to think about too carefully while I was still on the rope. I reached the bottom and let go and turned around and held up my light. The space below the shaft was large. much larger than the shaft diameter suggested from above. The ceiling was maybe 12 feet overhead, and the walls curved outward in both directions, creating a chamber that extended further than my light could reach in either direction. The floor was stone, worked stone, the same material as the shaft walls, but laid flat and worn smooth in the way stone gets when things have moved across it for a very long time. There were no furnishings, no objects, nothing that suggested habitation in the human sense. But the space had been made, shaped and constructed with clear intent by something that understood how to work with stone and had been doing it long enough to get very good at it. I stood at the base of the shaft and let my light sweep the chamber slowly. The silence down here was total, not the forest silence of things pausing, the silence of a space that absorbed sound. I could hear my own breathing and my heartbeat and nothing else. I chose the left passage because the floor showed more wear in that direction, and where meant more frequent use, and frequent use meant I was more likely to find what I was looking for. I moved slowly and kept my light steady, and after about 40 feet the passage curved and opened into a second chamber smaller than the first. That was where I found them. Paul was sitting against a far wall with his back straight and his hands in his lap and his eyes open. Jess was beside him in the same posture. They were both alive. I could see their chests moving. I crossed the chamber in a few quick steps and crouched in front of Paul and said his name. He looked at me. His eyes tracked to my face and held there. He was present in the physical sense, but there was a quality to his gaze that made the hair on my arm stand up. He was looking at me the way you look at something you are observing rather than something you are seeing. I said his name again and put my hand on his arm, and he did not pull away, but he did not respond either. I checked Jess. The same. Breathing. Eyes open. Tracking. But not there in the way a person is there when they are fully themselves. I got them both to their feet, and they stood without resistance and moved when I moved them, which was both a relief and deeply unsettling. I put Paul's hand on my jacket and told him to hold on, and started back toward the first chamber. We were halfway down the passage when I heard it. Not movement this time. A sound from somewhere deeper in the structure, low and resonant and structured in a way that did not sound like anything I had a name for. I kept moving. I did not look back. We reached the first chamber, and I found the reflective tape at the base of the shaft, and I got the rope in Paul's hands and talked him through the climb in short, direct sentences, and he climbed. Slowly, but he climbed. Jess went next. I followed last and came up out of the opening into the cold night air and stood up on the trail and looked around. The forest was silent. Paul and Jess were standing on the path, looking at nothing in particular. I put a hand on each of their shoulders and turned them toward the station and said one word. Walk. They walked. I stayed behind them and kept my light on the trail ahead and moved us at a pace that was as fast as they could manage without losing their footing on the uneven ground. Neither of them spoke. Neither of them stumbled. They moved with a mechanical steadiness that was functional but wrong, and I kept reminding myself that they were alive and upright and moving in the right direction, and that everything else could be dealt with once we were out of tree line. I was watching the trail, and watching them and watching the dark on either side path, and I almost missed it. At about mile 3, I caught movement in my peripheral vision. Left side, just inside the tree line. Something large and low, keeping pace with us through the undergrowth about 20 feet off the trail. I did not stop walking. I did not change my pace. I moved my light slowly to the left and let the beam graze the edge of the trees. I got 1 second of what the light showed me before I made the conscious decision to move my beam back to the trail and keep walking. 1 second was enough. It was tall, much taller than it had appeared to be, moving low through the undergrowth, which meant it had been crouching, and it had straightened when the light hit it. The proportions were wrong in a way that was hard to process quickly. The limbs were too long. The head was too large. The posture had a forward lean that suggested it spent time on all fours but was capable of standing. The skin, or whatever covered it, was dark and smooth, and it stood with a stillness that was absolute. It was looking directly at me. I kept walking. I kept my light on the trail. I kept Paul and Jess moving in front of me, and I breathed steadily and counted my steps and did not look back into the trees. It kept pace with us for another quarter mile, and then it did not. I cannot tell you exactly when it stopped following, because I did not look. I know it was gone by the time we hit mile 2, because the forest sounds came back. The insects, a distant owl, the creek, the forest returning to itself the way it had on the trail that morning when I had been crouched over the opening. We came out of the tree line at the trailhead and crossed a gravel lot, and I got Paul and Jess up onto the porch and through the front door. The station lights were on. Vic was standing in the middle of the common room in his boots and jacket, and he had clearly been awake for some time. Lena was at the table with her hands around Mug, and she looked up when we came through the door. Nobody said anything for a moment. I did not sleep that night. I sat at the table until the sky outside the station windows went from black to gray, and I turned the events of the last several hours over in my mind the way you turn a stone looking for what is underneath it. Paul and Jess were on the couch under blankets, and their breathing had deepened into something closer to real sleep as the hours passed. Lena checked on them twice before she went to her room, and each time she came back, she said the same thing. They were stabilizing. Vic stayed up with me for a while, and we sat across from each other and did not talk much. He was not angry in the way I had expected him to be. He was something closer to resigned. At some point around 3 a.m, he said that the thing that had followed us out of the tree line and then stopped was not random. He said in 11 years he had never seen one of them come that close to the station boundary. I asked him what he thought it meant. He said he did not know, and that not knowing was a part that concerned him more than anything else. He went to his room just before 4, and I stayed at the table and watched Paul and Jess and thought about what Lena had told me. Processed. That word had settled into my head and would not move. It implied a method, a system, something that took time and had stages and could be interrupted if you got there early enough. Lena had been interrupted. Paul and Jess had been interrupted. The couple from the first disappearance had not been. Whoever else was down, there had not been. I thought about the original logbook and Moss writing 2 taken this season within acceptable terms. I thought about how many seasons had passed since 1973 and how many entries like that one were stacked up across 50 years of acceptable terms. The number was not small. By the time the morning light was coming through the windows properly, I had made a second decision. I was going back down, not to retrieve anyone. Not that night, and maybe not ever in the way I had gone down the first time. I was going back because the thing in the tree line had made a choice, and I needed to understand what that choice meant before I could decide anything else. I needed to see the full shape of what was below, not just the entry chamber and the passage where I had found Paul and Jess. The whole of it, whatever Moss had negotiated in 1973, had been negotiated from a position of limited information, and I was not willing to let that negotiation stand as a final word on what was possible here. Lena was up by 7, and she made coffee and brought me a cup without being asked and sat down across from me. I told her what I was thinking. She listened without interrupting, and when I finished, she was quiet for a long moment. She said going back down alone was the wrong move. I asked her what the right move was. She said she did not know, but that going alone was still the wrong one. I told her I was not asking her to come with me. She said she was not offering. She said she was telling me that whatever the thing the tree line had done last night, it had done deliberately, and that deliberate behavior suggested the capacity for communication, and that communication required 2 parties willing to make themselves understood. I looked at her across the table. She looked back at me with the expression of someone who has thought about something for a very long time and arrived at a conclusion they wish they had not reached. I asked her if she had ever tried to communicate with them directly. She said, "Not in the way I meant." She said the arrangement as Moss had structured it was itself a form of communication. A set of terms observed by both sides was a conversation, even if no words were ever spoken. I said that was a very careful way of describing something that cost people their lives every few years. She said, yes, it was. She drank her coffee. I drank mine. Paul shifted on the couch and made a sound that was close to a word, but not quite, and we both looked at him. His eyes were open, and he was looking at the ceiling with more focus than he had shown since I brought him up from below. Lena went over and crouched beside him and spoke to him quietly. He turned his head toward her. That small movement felt significant in a way that was hard to explain, like watching a light flicker on in a room that had been dark for a long time. She came back to the table and said he was coming back faster than she had expected. I asked again what her recovery had been like. She sat down and wrapped both hands around her mug and looked at the window. She said the first few days were the hardest because you were aware enough to know something was wrong, but not aware enough to explain it. She said it felt like trying to think through water. Everything was present, but nothing had any weight to it. Emotions existed as concepts rather than experiences. She said by the end of the first week she was speaking again, but her words came out in the wrong order for another few days after that, and she had to concentrate to keep her sentences straight. She said the last thing to come back was a sense that she was the one experiencing her own life rather than watching it from a small distance. I asked her how long that took. She said 4 months for it to feel mostly normal, and another 4 before she stopped being aware of the distance at all. I asked her if it ever came back. She said sometimes at night, when she was very tired, she could feel the edge of it, like a scar that aches in cold weather. She said she had learned to live around it. I sat with that. Outside, the morning was fully up, and the forest looked exactly like it always did, and the birds were loud in the canopy, and there was no sign of anything wrong from where I was sitting. That was the thing about this place. It always looked exactly like it always did. Vic came out of his room just before 8 and poured coffee and looked at Paul and Jess on the couch, and the set of his shoulders changed slightly when he saw that Paul's eyes were tracking with more purpose. He sat down with us, and the 3 of us talked through what came next in practical terms. Paul and Jess needed monitoring and rest and food when they were ready for it. The district office would need some kind of update on the missing persons report, and Vic said he would handle that call in a way that bought us time. I said I needed 2 more days before I went back to the trail. Neither of them asked me to explain what I meant by that, and I did not offer to. What I did not tell them was that I had spent the early hours of the morning reading the last section of Moss's logbook again, and that in his final entry written on the last day of his posting in 1979, he had described something he called the invitation. He wrote that in his final week at the station, one of them had come to the edge of the tree line in broad daylight and stood there for a long time facing the station, not moving, not threatening, simply present and visible in a way that none of the previous contacts had been. Moss wrote that he believed it was deliberate and that it felt like being shown something rather than being confronted with something. He wrote that he had not known what to do with that at the time and had let his posting end without acting on it, and that he considered that the one genuine failure of his 8 years at the station. He wrote that if whoever read these words ever received a similar invitation, they should consider taking it. I had been thinking about that entry since 2 a.m. The thing in the tree line last night had followed us to the boundary and stopped. It had let us go. It had been visible long enough for me to see it clearly before I chose to look away. I did not know if that was the same thing Moss had described or something different, but I knew I was not going to make the same choice Moss had made. I was not going to let it pass without finding out what it meant. That afternoon, I walked the perimeter of the station and stood at the edge of the gravel lot where the lot met the grass, and the grass met the tree line, and I looked into the forest for a long time. Nothing looked back, at least nothing I could see. I went back inside and checked on Paul and Jess. Paul had eaten half a bowl of soup that Lena had made and was sitting up on his own. His eyes had color in them now in a way they had not the night before. Jess was still flat, but her breathing had a regularity to it that felt different from the mechanical rhythm she had come back with. I sat on the floor between the couch and the wall and leaned my back against the couch and closed my eyes for a while. I was not trying to sleep. I was trying to hear the station the way I had heard it before I knew what I knew. The creak of the roof in the wind, the hum of the old refrigerator, the sound of Vic moving around and the equipment shed out back. These were the sounds that had made up 5 years of my life in this place, and they were all still here, and all still exactly the same, and the world they described was not the world I was living in anymore. I opened my eyes and looked at the ceiling. The gap between what this place looked like and what it was had become the central fact of my existence out here, and I did not know yet how to close it. The next 2 days passed slowly. Paul came back in pieces the way Lena had described. Words first, and then sentences, and then something close to sustained thought. By the second evening, he was asking questions that I answered carefully and honestly because he deserved that. Jess progressed more slowly, but by the end of the second day, she was sitting up on her own and tracking conversations, even if she was not yet joining them. I watched Lena with them and understood things about her I had not understood before. The patience she had always had, the way she never rushed a situation, the particular quality of her stillness. These were not personality traits. They were the result of having been where Paul and Jess had been and having had to find her way back without a map. On the evening of the second day, I packed my gear again, different from the first trip. No rope this time. I was not planning to descend the shaft. I was going to the tree line at the station boundary after dark, and I was going to stand there and wait and see what came. Vic found me checking my pack on the porch just before 9 that night. He stood in the doorway and looked at me, and I looked back at him. He asked me what I was doing. I told him I was going to stand at the tree line and wait. He was quiet for a long moment. I followed. I told myself later that the decision had been made the moment I read Moss's final entry, and that standing at the tree line in the dark was just a point where I stopped pretending I had not already chosen. The thing moved into the forest at a pace that was slow enough for me to keep up, and I stayed about 10 feet behind it and kept my eyes on its outline against the dark between the trees. I had left my light off. I could see well enough by starlight where the canopy allowed it and in the sections where the canopy closed, and I followed sound and the sense of movement ahead of me rather than sight. We were not on the trail. We were moving parallel to it through the undergrowth, and the footing was uneven but manageable. I did not know how long we walked. My sense of time came apart somewhere in the first 10 minutes, and I stopped trying to track it. I focused on keeping the thing in front of me in range, and on not losing my footing, and on breathing steadily. We stopped at the root cluster at mile 5. The opening was already uncovered, as if it had been prepared. The thing crouched at the edge of the opening, and looked at me and then descended, not the way I descended with a rope and careful footwork. It went down the shaft the way water goes down a drain, fluid and fast and then gone. I stood at the edge and looked down into the dark. The reflective tape I had left on my first ascent was still there catching my light when I finally turned it on. I went down on the rope I had left in place from before and reached the bottom and turned around. The first chamber was lit, not by any light source I could identify. A faint luminescence came from the walls themselves, just enough to see by, without being enough to see clearly. The thing was at the far end of the chamber waiting. I followed it down the left passage the way I had gone before, and we passed a smaller chamber where I had found Paul and Jess. It was empty now. We kept going. The passage continued past that chamber further than I had gone on my first visit, and it widened as we moved deeper until it opened into a space that stopped me where I stood. The chamber was enormous. The ceiling was high enough that my light did not reach it. The walls curved in a way that made the space feel deliberate rather than excavated, like something that had been grown rather than carved. And it was full, not of objects, of people. They were arranged along the walls and in loose groupings across the floor in the same posture Paul and Jess had been in when I found them. Back straight, hands in laps, eyes open and seeing nothing with full attention. There were dozens of them. I swept my light slowly across the chamber and counted without meaning to, and stopped counting when I reached 40 because the number felt like something I was not ready to hold. Some of them were dressed in clothing that was recent enough to recognize. Hiking gear, trail clothes, the kind of thing people wore to the eastern trailhead on a weekend in October. Others wore clothing that was older, much older, wool and canvas and leather boots with lacing styles I associate with photographs rather than living people. Whatever this place was, it had been collecting people for a very long time. I stood in the entrance to that chamber for a long moment. The thing that had led me here was standing to my left, and it was watching me with the same patient stillness it had shown at the station tree line. It was not threatening. It was not posturing. It was waiting for me to understand something. I looked at the people in the chamber, and I looked at it. And I thought about Moss writing that whatever lived here was old the way a river is old, and I thought about what a river does. It does not attack the things that fall into it. It simply carries them where it goes. I thought about the terms and the boundary and the acceptable losses. And I thought about Lena coming back from below in pieces and spending 8 months finding herself again. I thought about the couple whose names were in the sign-in log, whose faces I had never seen. I looked at the thing beside me, and I said out loud into the silence of that enormous chamber that I needed it to let them go. I did not expect a response. I did not get one in any form I could immediately interpret. What happened was that the thing turned and moved back toward the passage and stopped and looked at me again. The same gesture it had made at the tree line, showing me a direction. I looked from it to the people in the chamber and back. It waited. I understood then that it was not showing me something further in. It was showing me the way back out. It was telling me to leave. I stood there for another long moment, looking at the faces of the people along the walls. The ones in old clothing had been here so long that whatever had been happening to them was finished, and they were something other than what they had started as. The ones in recent clothing were still in the early stages, and their faces still had the architecture of individual people. I memorized as many of them as I could in the time I had. I told myself I was going to find a way. Not tonight. Not by myself in the dark below a trail in a forest that had been running its own terms for 50 years. But I was going to find a way. I followed the thing back through the passage and into the first chamber and up the shaft and out into the cold night air. I stood at the root cluster and looked back down into the opening for a moment, and then I looked at the forest around me. The thing was gone. I was alone on the trail in the dark, and the forest was quiet, and the stars were out, and everything looked exactly the way it always did. I walked back to the station. The lights were on, and Vic was on the porch, and he stood up when he saw me come out of the tree line. I crossed a gravel lot and went up the steps, and he looked at my face and did not ask me anything. I went inside. Lena was at the table, and Paul was sitting up beside Jess on the couch, and both of them looked at me when I came through the door. Paul's eyes were fully present now, and I could see the question in them, even if he did not have the words for it yet. I sat down at the table across from Lena, and Vic came in behind me and closed the door. I told them what I had seen in the deep chamber. I gave them the number. Lena closed her eyes. Vic sat down slowly. I told them the terms as Moss had written them, and as they had been maintained for 50 years were not a solution. They were a postponement, a way of making something unacceptable manageable enough to live with. I told them the thing below had shown me the people in that chamber, and I did not believe it had done that to threaten me. I believed it had done that for the same reason. It had let me bring Paul and Jess out. It was showing me something. I did not yet know what it wanted me to understand from that, but I was going to figure it out. Vic looked at the table. Lena opened her eyes and looked at me with that expression I had seen on her. Before that was tired and sad and something else. This time I recognized as something else. It was hope, not the bright, uncomplicated kind. The kind that has been worn down to its last layer and is still there anyway. I picked up Moss's logbook from where it had been sitting on the table since the night I had brought it out of supply room. I turned to the last page, his final entry. I read the last lines again the way I had read them a dozen times already. Then I turned the page. There was one more entry after his, written in different handwriting, smaller and more careful than Moss's. At the top of the page was a date. The date was 3 days before I was hired. The entry was 4 lines long, and the last line contained my name. I sat at that table in the light of the station with the forest, holding everything it held outside the windows, and I read those 4 lines and understood that nothing about my being here had ever been accidental. Whatever was below that trail had been patient for a very long time. It had been waiting for something specific. I was still working out what that meant when the lights in the station flickered once and held, and somewhere out in the dark past the tree line, something moved and the forest went completely silent. I set the logbook down on the table and looked at Lena. She was watching me with the careful stillness she always had, but there was something different in it now. I asked her if she had known about the entry with my name. She did not answer right away. She looked at Vic. He was studying the surface of the table the way a man studies something when he does not want to be the one to speak first. I asked again. Lena said she had found the entry in her 2nd year at the station. She said she had not known what it meant at the time and had told herself it was a coincidence, a name that happened to match. I asked her when she stopped telling herself that. She said the day I arrived and she saw my face for the first time and understood that the forest had been expecting me. I sat back in my chair. The fire in the small stove across the room popped and settled. Paul had shifted on the couch and was watching me with his newly returned eyes, and Jess had turned her head in my direction with the slow deliberateness of someone who is listening very carefully to a conversation they cannot quite follow yet. I asked Vic how long he had known. He said since his 6th year. He said a ranger who had been stationed here in the 80s had called him out of the blue one afternoon and told him to check the page after Moss's last entry. He said he had asked the man who wrote the 2nd entry, and the man had said he did not know. He had woken up one morning with compulsion to write it, and had done so, and had transferred out of the station the following week and had never come back. I looked at the 4 lines again. They did not say anything dramatic. They did not announce anything or make any predictions. They described a ranger. The description was specific enough to be unmistakable. Height. The particular quality of stubbornness the writer described as an unwillingness to leave people behind. A note that this one would not accept the terms. And at the end, a single sentence that I read 3 times before I was willing to accept what it said. It said the arrangement would change when this ranger arrived because what lived below had been waiting for someone who would not accept the terms and would come looking instead. I put the logbook flat on the table and pressed both hands over it and looked at the ceiling.